The house had always been quiet. Too quiet. As Julian stepped through the creaking door, the air thickened around him as though it were holding its breath. The hallway stretched endlessly, and despite its grandeur, an unnatural chill seemed to have settled in every corner, every shadow. The house itself was alive, or so it felt. Alive with a secret it was desperate to keep. Julian had inherited this house from his late aunt, a woman he barely remembered. The old mansion was said to have been passed down through generations, but no one had lived there in decades. The very thought of stepping inside had always filled him with unease. Yet now, here he was, standing at its threshold, the key in his hand. He had come to collect his inheritance, but what he had not anticipated was the unsettling presence of a small doll sitting upon an antique chair in the farthest room. Its porcelain face was unnervingly perfect, and its glassy eyes seemed to glimmer, even in the dim light of the evening. For days, Julian had heard faint whispers, like a wind brushing past his ear. At first, he believed it to be his imagination, a trick of the mind after years of neglect. But as the whispers grew louder, clearer, he began to question his own sanity. They weren't just whispers, they were words meant for him. "Come closer, Julian." The voice called out his name with a sweet, eerie tone, one that seemed to come from the very walls of the mansion. Julian felt his heart race. Who could be here? The house had been empty for years, hadn't it? Yet there was a presence, someone waiting. The doll's eyes followed him as he approached. The deeper he walked into the room, the more intense the whispers became, circling his thoughts, filling his mind with dread. With a trembling hand, Julian reached out for the doll, its cold porcelain surface sending a shock through his fingertips, and as soon as his skin made contact with it, the whispers stopped. And in the silence that followed, Julian felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The silence in the room was oppressive. Julian stood motionless, his fingers still pressed against the cold porcelain of the doll. His mind raced, but every thought seemed to dissolve into the heavy air around him. There was something wrong. Something about the way the doll sat there, waiting, watching. With a sharp breath, Julian pulled his hand away, feeling an odd sense of relief. But the relief was fleeting. The whispers had stopped. Yes, but in their place was something far worse, an unbearable stillness. His surroundings seemed to close in on him, the walls seemingly breathing, the air thick with something unnameable. He turned to leave the room, but before he could take a single step, a soft sound echoed from behind him. A faint scratching noise, as if something or someone was moving in the dark. Julian froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He glanced back at the doll. Its eyes, which had been mere glass reflections moments ago, now seemed different, alive. He could swear the doll was no longer looking at the space around it, but directly at him. The whisper returned, now more insistent, reverberating through the walls. "Don't leave me, Julian. You belong here. With me." His heart raced, and an inexplicable terror flooded his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to obey. Instead, he found himself walking toward the doll once more, as though some invisible force had taken hold of him. When his fingers brushed against its porcelain face again, the room seemed to shift. The walls rippled like water disturbed by a stone. The air thickened, pressing in on him. He could barely breathe. In a sudden flash of clarity, Julian realized the truth. The house, the doll, the whispers. It was all part of something far older than he could comprehend. A twisted web of fate that had bound him here, whether he wanted it or not. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then, something in the shadows stirred. Something watching. A figure, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A shape that moved and yet did not. It stood just beyond the edge of the light, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Julian tried to move, tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The figure stepped forward, its eyes gleaming as it reached out with long, skeletal fingers. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, its voice familiar, cold, and unmistakably alive. Julian's pulse pounded in his ears as the figure in the shadows stepped closer. Its form was barely perceptible, like a fleeting memory. But the eyes, those eyes, were undeniable. They glowed with a strange, otherworldly light, pulling him in, binding him to the very air around him. He should have run, he knew that, but his body refused to obey. His feet were rooted to the ground as though some unseen force had locked him in place. The figure's hollow, breathless voice filled the room again, and Julian felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. "You've come for what you can never truly own," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers layered over one another. "The house has been waiting for you." The words twisted in his mind, making it hard to think, to remember. Who was this? Why was it speaking to him as if it knew him? "Who are you?" Julian managed to rasp, his voice barely a whisper. His throat was dry, constricted, as if he were choking on the very air around him. The figure's mouth, or what passed for one, stretched into a smile, if it could even be called that. It was a grotesque thing, twisted and wrong, but Julian couldn't tear his gaze away. "You know me," it said, its voice a low growl like a predator savoring its prey. "I am the past you've tried so hard to forget, the part of you that you can never escape." Julian's mind reeled. The past? Forget? The pieces, like fragments of a shattered mirror, began to slip into place. He had seen this figure before, in his dreams. No, not just in his dreams. In the flashes of memory that haunted him, images that seemed to disappear whenever he tried to grasp them. The doll, the house, and then the flash of a childhood long buried in darkness. A cold shiver ran down his spine. "You are me?" he whispered, the realization dawning on him like the sudden weight of an unspoken truth. The figure laughed, a deep, resonant laugh that reverberated through his bones. "No, Julian, you are me. You always have been, always will be." Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping as if reality itself was unraveling. Julian stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his head spinning, his vision blurred, and as he collapsed to his knees, the world around him melted into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the mansion. He was back in a place he had not seen in years. A dimly lit room, its walls covered in dust and cobwebs, the same doll lying motionless on the floor before him. The whispers started again. "Welcome back." But this time, Julian knew, this was no dream. Julian's body trembled as he stood in the abandoned room, his breath quick and shallow. The doll lay on the floor, as still and lifeless as before, yet something about it now seemed darker, more malevolent. The whispers had stopped, but they lingered in his mind like an echo he couldn't escape. He forced himself to rise, his legs stiff from fear. The familiar, oppressive atmosphere of the mansion surrounded him once more, yet there was something different about it now. The air felt thicker, as though it were pressing down on him from all sides, suffocating him. His thoughts swirled, disjointed, as if pieces of his reality had begun to fall apart, one by one. The room was unchanged. It was as if he had never left. The same dust particles floated in the dim light, the same cracked windows casting long shadows across the floor. But Julian knew better. He wasn't in the same place anymore. Something had shifted. The house was no longer just a house. It was a prison, a trap. His eyes turned once again to the doll. It was impossible to look away. Its eyes, black as night, seemed to gleam in the dimness, mocking him. The longer he stared, the more he felt himself drawn to it, as though some invisible thread was pulling him closer. No longer able to resist, Julian reached down and picked the doll up. It was cold, colder than before, and its smooth porcelain surface felt unnaturally slick under his touch. He cradled it in his hands, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn he felt a heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, coming from it. A cold laugh, low and guttural, echoed in the corners of the room. "You still don't understand, do you, Julian?" The voice was clear, But it wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from everywhere, seeping into his mind, consuming his thoughts. This house, this doll, it is all part of a greater plan. A plan that you are the center of. You've been chosen, just like the others before you. The walls around him seemed to stretch, warping and twisting in a way that defied all logic. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel his knees beginning to buckle beneath him. The air felt thick with the weight of something ancient, something evil. And in that moment, Julian realized the truth that had been hidden from him all this time. He was not just a visitor in this house. He was its next victim. The doll's eyes, now glowing faintly, seemed to lock onto his with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You belong to me," it whispered, its voice now eerily familiar. "You always have." The room spun violently, and Julian staggered backward. His hands reached out, grasping for anything to steady himself, but everything felt unreal. Nothing was solid, nothing was as it should be. The world itself seemed to be falling away piece by piece, and in the midst of the chaos, he heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the dark corner of the... From someone or something was coming. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing through the room like a death knell. Julian's pulse quickened as his eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The room, once familiar, had turned into a maze of shadows and distorted shapes. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on him, suffocating him with their oppressive weight. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body refused to obey. The doll in his hands had become unbearably cold, as though it were alive with a malevolent force. He could feel its presence, its power, seeping into his skin, into his very soul. The figure from before, the one that had haunted his every thought, emerged from the darkness. It was tall, its face obscured by a veil of shadow, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting reality itself. Every step it took felt as if the ground itself trembled beneath him. Julian wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. His body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so intense that it threatened to tear him apart. "You are too late," the figure whispered, its voice a twisted mix of malice and sorrow. "The ritual has already begun. You cannot stop it." Julian's mind spun as the words crashed into him. The ritual? What ritual? He had never heard of such a thing. Yet, deep within him, a part of him knew the truth. The house, the doll, the figure standing before him, it was all connected. He was part of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The figure raised its hand, and the room seemed to shudder in response. The shadows around them deepened, swirling like a living thing, engulfing the space in an inky blackness. Julian felt the pressure around him grow, squeezing the breath from his lungs. "You've always been part of this, Julian," the figure continued. "Your soul is bound to this place. You cannot escape it, no matter how far you run." The doll in his hands pulsed with a strange energy, as if it were alive, as if it were the source of this dark power. And then, with a sudden surge of realization, Julian understood. He had been chosen, not as an heir, not as a visitor, but as a vessel, a part of the ritual to bind his soul to the house forever. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. Julian could feel its icy breath on his skin, its fingers brushing against his own. And then, as if the world itself had come to a halt, the figure spoke in a voice that shook the very foundations of his being. "Welcome home, Julian. Your soul will never leave." A surge of energy shot through him, and in that instant Julian's world shattered. The world spun wildly, twisting and warping as if reality itself was being torn apart at the seams. Julian's body felt weightless, like he was floating through an endless void. His mind was a storm of confusion, a whirlwind of shattered thoughts, and yet, amid the chaos, one thing remained painfully clear. He was trapped. Trapped in a place beyond time, beyond reason, beyond life itself. The shadows surrounded him, dark and thick, pressing against him from all sides, suffocating him. The doll, still clutched in his hands, pulsed with an eerie light, its eyes gleaming like twin orbs of darkness. Julian's fingers trembled as he gripped it tighter, but it only grew colder, colder still, until it felt like it was draining the warmth from his very soul. The figure stood before him, its presence an unrelenting force, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. Julian tried to speak, but no words came. His throat was tight as if some unseen power was choking the life from him. "You were always mine, Julian," the figure whispered, its voice a terrible caress. "You were never meant to escape. You belong to the house, to the doll, to the darkness that resides within these walls. Your soul is bound here for eternity." The walls of the room flickered and dissolved, replaced by an endless expanse of blackness. There were no doors, no windows, no way out. It was as if the house had swallowed him whole, trapping him in a timeless prison where escape was a forgotten dream. Julian's heart raced and a cold sweat coated his skin. His mind was screaming for freedom, for release from the nightmare that had consumed him. But the more he struggled, the tighter the grip of the house grew. His soul was shackled, and there was no way to break free. The doll's eyes, once mere reflections of glass, now gleamed with a terrible truth. The truth that Julian could not escape. The truth that the house, this house, had always been his prison, even before he had set foot in it. The house had been waiting for him, watching him, calling to him, and now it had him. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers long and cold, and gently placed itself on Julian's chest. He felt the weight of the touch, a sensation that burned through him like ice. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just physical pain. It was something deeper, something ancient and primal. It was the pain of knowing that he was lost, that he would never see the world outside these walls again. The figure smiled, a smile that twisted its features into something monstrous. "You are home now," it whispered, "and you will remain here, as part of the doll, part of the house, forever." As the figure's grip tightened, Julian felt his essence begin to unravel, his very being merging with the darkness that surrounded him. His body grew cold, his senses dull. The whispers of the house, once distant, now filled his mind, their voices rising in a cacophony of despair. The last thing he saw was the doll's face, its eyes staring at him with an unsettling calm. The last thing he heard was its voice, soft and final. "Welcome home, Julian, you will never leave." And so, Julian's soul was forever tied to the house, entangled with the doll and the darkness that hid within. The mansion, once a place of forgotten memories, was now an eternal prison, a place where the whispers of the past would never cease. Julian came to claim an inheritance, but instead he became the inheritance, a part of the house itself, of its darkness, of its terror. His struggle to escape was in vain, as the house was always waiting for him, always watching. In the end, he was not her guest but her next prisoner, trapped in the very fabric of her cursed existence. And so, the cycle continued, with the doll's empty eyes always watching, waiting for the next soul to claim. Thanks for watching. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Please share this with others who love a good mystery, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling stories. Your feedback means a lot and helps me create even better stories for you. Mom, she's watching you. Sophia's voice trembled as she stood frozen at the foot of the staircase, her small finger pointing toward the living room. The pale light from the dimming sunset cast strange shadows on the walls, but the air in the house was thick with something more than just the approaching night. Lena, her mother, looked up from the book she was reading, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She thought it was just another one of her daughter's wild imaginations. It had been a stressful few weeks with moving into this old house, trying to settle in, and dealing with the strange unease that seemed to follow them. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Turning her gaze toward the living room, her eyes fell upon the old porcelain doll sitting on the mantelpiece. Its cold, lifeless eyes staring back at her. "Stop it, Sophie." "Lena," said gently, rising from her chair. "There's nothing to worry about, it's just a doll." But Sophia's eyes never left the doll. She stepped back slowly, her small feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. "She's watching you, Mommy. She never blinks." Lena let out a nervous laugh, but something about the doll unsettled her. She had never liked the way it seemed to stare, as though it was waiting, watching. The previous owners had left it behind, along with the rest of the furniture, and despite her attempts to discard it, Lena couldn't bring herself to part with it. There was something about it that felt familiar. Sophia's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mommy," she moved. Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What?" The doll was no longer in its original position. It was slightly turned, its head tilted ever so slightly toward Lena, as if it had shifted in the span of mere moments. Her breath caught in her throat, and she hurriedly crossed the room to inspect it. But there was no evidence that it had been touched. "You're imagining things," Lena muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. Sophia shook her head. "I saw it. She's coming for us." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Lena's gaze fell on the doll again. The eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, were staring directly at her now. As Lena reached out to move the doll, the power flickered, plunging the house into darkness. The only sound that filled the room was the sound of Sophia's fearful breathing. "Mom," Sophia whispered, "she's behind you." Lena spun around, but there was nothing there. Or was there? Something shifted in the shadows, just out of sight. Her heart raced, her breath shallow as she realized the doll wasn't the only thing watching anymore. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her eyes scanning the darkened room. The flickering light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, casting long, stretching shadows. For a moment, she thought she might have imagined it, just a trick of the mind, brought on by the stress of the move and the strange happenings around the house. But then, she heard it, a soft, raspy whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. "Mommy!" Lena froze, her pulse racing. She turned back toward Sophia, but the little girl was no longer in the corner, no longer standing by the stairs. "Sophia?" Lena called out, her voice rising with panic. The silence that followed was suffocating. There was no answer. With a racing heart, Lena hurried to the foot of the stairs, her mind a whirlwind of terror. Could Sophie have gone upstairs? She knew it. Wasn't like her to wander off, especially in a house this unfamiliar. But the house, something about it felt alive, as if it were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Her hand gripped the railing as she slowly ascended the stairs, the creaking steps echoing through the empty hallways. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch longer as she moved higher, and the air grew colder. Lena's skin prickled with unease, and she could have sworn she heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she found the hallway empty. Only the dim glow of the moonlight from the window illuminated the floorboards. But there, at the end of the hall, stood Sophia. Her back turned, her small figure bathed in the soft light. "Sophia," Lena whispered, her voice shaking. The child didn't respond. Lena stepped closer, the hairs on her neck standing on end. She reached out, her hand trembling, but just before she could touch her daughter's shoulder, Sophia spun around. Her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto Lena's with an intensity that made Lena's breath catch in her chest. It wasn't Sophia's voice that spoke next. "Come closer, Mommy." The voice was deep, guttural, and unmistakably not her daughter's. Lena staggered back in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs felt weak, her hands clammy as the room seemed to close in around her. Sophia's mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide for a child's face. "She's waiting for you. She never blinks." Lena turned, eyes searching for an escape. But the hallway stretched longer than she remembered, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. The house was no longer a place she could recognize, and the once familiar rooms were now alien, suffocating her. The air felt thick with something dark, something wrong. Behind her, the whisper came again, closer this time. "You're not alone." Lena turned, but there was no sign of Sophia. The house felt colder, darker, as if something had shifted. Something not just in the house, but in her daughter. Lena's skin crawled as a chill ran down her spine, the voice echoing in her mind. "Come closer, Mommy." Was it Sophia? Or something worse? Lena's heart raced in her chest as the darkness in the hallway seemed to close in around her. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the wall for support. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was pressing against her, suffocating her with every breath. The unsettling feeling she had tried to ignore since they first moved in was now overwhelming. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the doll. Sophia was gone. The hallway stretched out before her, impossible to navigate. No longer was it a simple, quiet corridor. It seemed alive, twisting and bending with every step Lena took, as if the house were playing a cruel game with her. Her pulse quickened with every footstep, the wall seeming to pulse in time with her heartbeat. "Sophia?" Lena whispered, her voice faltering in the eerie silence. There was no response. She reached the door to the room at the end of the hall, her breath catching in her throat. It had been closed earlier, she was sure of it. But now it was ajar, the faintest sliver of light shining through, beckoning her forward. With a deep breath, Lena pushed the door open. Inside, the room was cold, far colder than it should have been for the time of year. The curtains were drawn, casting everything in a dim, gray hue. At first, Lena didn't see anything unusual, but as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she froze. The doll was sitting on the bed. The porcelain figure was positioned upright, its eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at Lena, just as it had stared at her earlier. But this time it felt different. This time, it felt as though it was waiting for her. Lena stepped closer, her legs heavy with dread. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, but there was no sign of Sophia, just the doll and the strange, oppressive air that seemed to hang over everything. Suddenly a voice barely above a whisper echoed through the room. "You've found me." Lena whipped around, but there was no one there. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it had been unmistakable. It was deeper than Sophia's, and it carried an unnatural, chilling edge. The temperature in the room dropped further, and Lena felt her breath turn to fog in the air. She turned back to the bed, but the doll's eyes were no longer staring at her. They had shifted. They were now looking toward the door. Lena's blood ran cold. She reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but the door slammed shut with a violent force before she could touch it. The room plunged into complete darkness, and the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing from all directions. "Come closer," they coaxed. "She's waiting." Lena's pulse raced. She couldn't move. The air was suffocating, and the only sound she could hear was her own frantic breathing, mingling with the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere in the room. Then, as if on cue, the whisper came. Again, and it was unmistakably clear. "You're too late." The lights flickered back on, and Lena's eyes went wide in shock. The doll was no longer on the bed. It was standing, right in front of her, its cold, unblinking eyes locked onto hers. And in the dim reflection in the mirror, Lena saw something behind her. Something moving. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Lena's breath hitched in her throat as the lights flickered back on. Her heart pounded violently against her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. The doll, no longer sitting on the bed, was now standing directly in front of her. Its unblinking eyes seemed to burn into hers, unrelenting and cold. But it wasn't just the doll that made Lena's skin crawl. In the dim reflection of the room's mirror, someone, was standing behind her. Lena's pulse raced as she turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just empty air stretching behind her into the shadows. The whispers began again, this time louder, surrounding her from all directions. "You're not alone. You've never been alone." Lena stumbled back, her hand searching frantically for the door. But when she reached for the knob, it twisted by itself and the door swung open with a force that made her stumble into the hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, like long fingers reaching from the darkness. She stood in the doorway, eyes darting around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the air thick with a suffocating presence. Behind her, the doll was no longer standing where it had been. Lena's head snapped around, panic rising in her chest. It was in the hallway now, its cold, lifeless eyes never leaving her. Then came the voice again. This time more chilling than ever. You can't escape. Lena's hands trembled as she backed away from the doll, her eyes never leaving it. She had to get out, she had to get Sophia. The house was alive with something far darker than she could understand, and the doll was at the center of it all. Without thinking, she turned and ran down the hallway, her feet slapping against the floor. But as she passed the door to the living room, her breath caught. Sophia was standing in the doorway, her back turned to her, just like before. But this time, there was something wrong, something terrifyingly wrong. Sophia's shoulders were shaking, her body racked with silent sobs. Lena's heart broke at the sight of her daughter, but when Sophia turned to face her, Lena gasped in horror. Her daughter's eyes were wide and unblinking, just like the doll's. Her mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't hers. I told you, Sophia whispered, her voice a hollow, distorted version of itself. She's waiting for you. Lena tried to reach for her, but Sophia stepped back and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, leaving Lena alone in the dark once again. The whispers filled her ears, louder and more insistent than ever. She's waiting, always waiting. The floor beneath Lena's feet shifted, and for a moment she thought she was falling. But the house didn't let her fall. The ground seemed to pulse and ripple beneath her, and she felt a strange weight pressing on her chest, as if the very walls were alive, hungry for something. Lena fell to her knees, gasping for air as the house seemed to tighten its grip on her. She could hear the faint sound of a clock ticking, but it wasn't the one from earlier. This one was closer, right behind her. When she turned, she saw it. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was someone else, standing in the doorway. And it was smiling. Lena's chest heaved with each frantic breath as she stumbled through the hallway, her mind racing with terror. The house seemed to be alive, pulsing around her as if it had its own heartbeat. She could still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, weaving through the air like a sinister lullaby. They're waiting, they murmured, over and over. They never blink, they never leave. Every step Lena took felt heavier, like the very floorboards beneath her feet were pulling her down, trapping her in this nightmarish maze. She tried to think, to focus, but her mind was clouded with the image of Sophia's distorted face. Those wide, unblinking eyes, the unnatural smile stretched across her lips. What had happened to her daughter? Lena reached the stairs, her hand gripping the railing for support. She hesitated for a moment, the sound of the whispers growing louder, more frantic. It felt as though something was just behind her, moving in the shadows. But when she turned, there was nothing. Only the empty hallway, stretching into the darkness. With a surge of panic, Lena began to climb the stairs, her legs shaking beneath her. The air felt colder with each step, and the house seemed to be growing darker, more oppressive. She had to find a way out. She had to find Sophia before it was too late. At the top of the stairs, Lena's eyes darted to the end of the hallway. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from the crack. Her heart skipped a beat. She had never opened that door. Never even thought to. But now it felt like it was calling her. Without thinking, Lena moved toward it, her breath shallow and quick. As she reached for the door, she hesitated. What if something was waiting for her inside? What if it was a trap, a way to draw her deeper into the house's grip? The whispers came again, louder this time, as though they were coming from behind. The door itself, you can't run, you can't hide. Lena flung the door open. Inside, the attic was empty, save for one thing, the doll. It was sitting in the middle of the floor, just as it had been when she first saw it. but now its eyes were fixed on her. The room felt colder, the air thick with the unmistakable presence of something watching her. Lena stepped forward, her body tense with fear. She had to do something. She had to stop whatever was happening before it consumed her and her daughter. Suddenly, the doll's head jerked to the side, and Lena froze. The room seemed to shift, the walls closing in on her as though the space itself was distorting. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls, and then, from behind her, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Lena spun around, her heart in her throat, but once again, nothing. She reached for the door to leave, but when she touched the handle, it turned on its own. The door swung wide open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was Sophia. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips stretched into that same chilling smile. She stepped forward, her body jerking unnaturally with each movement. "Told you she was waiting," Sophia whispered, her voice distorted, hollow. "And now, she's here." The door slammed shut behind Lena, trapping her inside the attic with her daughter and the thing that had taken her. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unnatural pressure. Lena's hands shook as she backed away from Sophia, her mind struggling to process what was happening. But as her gaze flicked to the corner of the attic, her blood turned to ice. The doll was no longer on the floor. It was standing in the corner, watching them both. Lena's heart was pounding so violently it felt as though it might burst from her chest. The attic was a cold, suffocating place, the shadows too thick, the air too heavy. She was trapped, surrounded by things that shouldn't be real, things that couldn't be real. But they were. Sophia's eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, burned into Lena's soul. She took a step back, the floor creaking beneath her, and the whispering grew louder, closer, as though it was all coming from inside her own head. "She's here." Sophia's voice rasped again, the words barely recognizable, twisted with something dark and ancient. Lena's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "What is happening to you, Sophia? What's happening to this house?" Her eyes darted to the corner of the room. The doll. It was standing there, still as a statue, its empty eyes staring at them. The same chilling grin stretched across its porcelain face. Suddenly, Lena felt it, cold fingers brushing against her skin. The room seemed to shift again, warping around her like a living, breathing thing. Her legs felt weak, her breath shallow. She couldn't breathe. It was as though the walls were closing in, suffocating her, and the doll's eyes, those unblinking, all-knowing eyes, followed her every move. "Mommy," Sophia whispered again, but this time, the voice wasn't hers. It was something darker, deeper. It echoed in the attic, filling every corner of the room. Lena turned quickly, desperate to escape, but the door she had once opened so eagerly, was gone. It had vanished, leaving nothing but the cold, suffocating walls. There was no escape. Her eyes locked with the doll's once more, and she felt the air grow heavier. Her hands shook, her body trembling. The whispers, now all-encompassing, seemed to call her name, pull her toward the doll. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were frozen and her mind was clouded by a terrifying realization. The doll wasn't just watching her. It was waiting for her. "I told you." Sophia's voice came again. But this time, it wasn't Sophia. It was the thing behind her, the one that had taken her place. The voice that came from the depths of the darkness, from the thing that lived within the house. "You've already made your choice." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The doll's eyes seemed to glow now, a pale, unnatural light radiating from them. The room pulsed with an energy that Lena couldn't comprehend, an energy that vibrated through her very bones. And then, as though in slow motion, the doll's mouth began to move. The smile stretched impossibly wide, the porcelain cracking at the edges as if it were alive, awakening. Lena tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed by the presence in the room, by the gaze of the doll, She watched helplessly as its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. The last thing Lena saw before the world went black was Sophia's face, her eyes still wide, unblinking, and the grin on the doll's face stretching beyond reason, beyond anything human. And then there was nothing. The house stood silent, still. The whispers ceased. But in the attic, where the doll once stood, there was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a faint tapping, flicker of movement. The doll's eyes had blinked,